Yeah, I guess you could. Okay, we'll record. Hello, everybody. Second class of review. All right, so the thing was, okay, let's start here. I don't know. One of you guys could probably look it up, but Seneca Falls was like something like 1830. I don't know. I'm taking a guess at 1832, something like that. Do you remember this? This was in our last unit, right? This was when women got together and they like challenged the domestic sphere, right? And then mostly what we talked about was like the vote. I can't even find it. Do you remember that? Okay. So this is kind of like context or analyzing. It's just kind of like background info. But the document we're looking at for like the, I guess the reason why I picked this one is because in a debate, nobody mentioned this fact. I didn't hear you guys mention it. I didn't hear my other class mention it. So I wanted to make sure that people didn't just not mention it because they didn't get the document. So where is my, trying to find the document, sorry. Let me do this. That's not it. Ah, I'm so confused. I got lost on the internet. Okay. I'm up there. Where am I? This can go down here. This is here. All right, this is real. Share screen. Oh my God. I'm getting really, my brain is melting. Okay, screen. Okay, share. Now, I have to find the DBQ. I'm just here. Yay, I did it. Okay. So the one that's on the intro was Doc H, right? This is it. And so the thing I had people do was like watch this little video, which was okay. It didn't focus on exactly what I wanted to, but it was good enough, right? And so Doc H is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right? Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Where do we know Elizabeth Cady Stanton from? Seneca Falls, right? So we know, I'm just going to call it ECS, right? We know she was here. So, you know, 3 documents you have to analyze, right? So 3 documents you have to analyze. This Doc H might not be a terrible one to analyze because you know this person, right? I could be like Elizabeth Cady Stanton from Seneca Falls, right? Who advocated, right? And so by adding in this, that is analyzing. That is talking about like a throwback to like what her perception is of her history. Does that make sense? Okay. What's weird about this document is like, what is she saying in this document, right? And I want you guys to remember like what led to Seneca Falls. We talked about like abolitionism. You know, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an abolitionist. She was, you know, in that second Great Awakening stuff. She was into all those reforms, right? She was into this like perfectionism. So we have Seneca Falls, and then it's like, how do we get from this to Doc H? And what Doc H says is what? Think of Patrick and Sambo and Hans and I can't even read. I can't read with my glasses and I can't read it on. They're all fogged up. Young folks who do not know the difference between a monarchy and a republic, who cannot read the Declaration of Independence or Webster's spelling book, making laws for and blah, blah, blah. This amendment creates an antagonism everywhere between educated, refined women and the lower orders of men, especially in the South. So, what is she doing with this? What is her tone? What is she saying? Does it sound good? When she's calling somebody Sambo? Let's talk about her racism and what's also known as nativism in this, right? Huh? Those are names, right? Think of Patrick Who is she making fun of when she says Patrick? Anyone? Who does she hate? Like St. Patrick's? Irish, right? Think of Patrick. This is like at the time, there's a lot of anti-Irish sentiment, right? And so Patrick is like, think of Sambo, Black folks, right? And Young Tung, Chinese immigrants, right? So what they're saying is like, you're gonna give the vote to Black people and immigrants before you give it to like middle-class educated white folks, women especially. How dare you give the vote to these men before you give it to us when we've been fighting for it since 1832? Does that make sense? Right? And so, you know, it's a complicated document because she's talking about the 14th Amendment, and she's kind of showing her frustration that men are getting it first. And then what's weird is you get this like racism in it. You know, even though we think of Elizabeth Cady Stanton as being like an abolitionist and like, you know, all this other stuff, right? It's this. So it's, I don't know, it's a lot. So that's kind of what the video went over. But I didn't want people to kind of look over this because it's kind of complicated, you know. But one of the questions you can think about is like, how did Elizabeth Cady Stanton go from like, you know, working with Frederick Douglass to calling people Sambo, right? What happened in between there, right? And so one of the things is the 14th Amendment, which essentially says that anyone who's born in the United States is a citizen. It doesn't specifically say Black people are citizens. It says if you're born, anyone born in the US is a citizen. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I don't know if she got arrested, but I know Susan B. Anthony got arrested and a bunch of other women. What they basically did is after the 14th Amendment was passed, they all were like, let's challenge the 14th Amendment. And they went to the polls and they got arrested for voting. And their defense was, hey, well, we have this 14th Amendment. We should be citizens now because we're born in the United States. But they get arrested and it's upheld. So it's like she's frustrated with the fact that, you know, women are being excluded from these things. Does that make sense? And I think, I gotta look it up. I think the word men is actually in the 14th Amendment as well. So anyway, does that make sense? And then like with the 15th Amendment, they're also not included. So she's just like, all right, I'm sick of it. And so what actually ends up happening is the women's rights movement gets split because, because they get split because like some women are like, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you're being racist, right? And we're not willing to fight this. And then like Elizabeth Cady Stanton takes this other group who continues like kind of hating on the 14th and 15th Amendment. Yeah, go ahead.
So the reason she like went on this whole racist spiel is because she got arrested for something. Like, is that kind of what? Like,
yeah, kind of, yeah. And she's just like, she is, I mean, it is racism, right? So it kind of shows that you could be abolitionist and still be racist, right? You know, you can be progressive, you can be for all of these things, but you know, there's still these elements of like white supremacy that's within her, right, as well. So this is where like a lot of folk, you know, I remember learning about this in like college and I was like, oh, that's sad, but you know, it's real, it's what happened. So yeah, she kind of says a lot of bad things about like everybody. So it's like equal opportunity. It's like Irish, Asians, and Black folks. So she hits it all. German, yeah, anti-German as well. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, it's kind of like, why don't you give the vote to these fine, upstanding white folk, right? Why are you giving it to everybody else? So anyway, a lot of people did not use that, but I wanted to make sure that folk knew what was going on. And especially because it's Elizabeth Cady Stanton, if it does show up, you will be able to like analyze it because we've seen it before, right? It's a name you should know. You could tie it back with that. All right, so we started in my last class what do you call it? Review. I think I posted it on let me just make sure it's here. I posted it up on, yeah, this is all the stuff for the DBQ. It's right here. I left it so that other folks can't add on to it because I didn't want it to get messed up, but I was just going to take notes as we go through. And then if you guys have questions, we can, there's a bunch of documents that we haven't covered yet. So I figure we'll focus on those and we'll kind of go through quickly the other ones that we've already covered. So starting with context, yeah, I think, how did you guys do on your DBQs? Did we get our context points last time?
Yeah, when I checked, it didn't say like the amount of points per thing or not. It just said like blank out of that.
It didn't show you like the actual rubric?
It didn't say like one or two or one or zero.
Really? Let me see.
I checked that yesterday during class and it did.
Well, that sucks because I was assuming that you guys got to see like which points you got. I don't know. It's the first time I was using like in class like the rubric on the side. I don't know. Usually on the DBQ, if I wrote, I usually try to write when I see it. So like, you know, if I see the context and the notes, I'll also write like good context, good analysis, you know. Anyway, so context. I guess I'll go into this DBQ and then you guys could ask questions. But so in the debate, we had like 4 categories. It was like political and economic and social and cultural. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to take one category from one debate and one category from another. So like it could be economic and social. It could be social and political. Does that make sense? So it's going to be like one from one and one from the other. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to narrow the documents from the debate to 7. So there's only going to be 7 of these documents on there. And so there's a lot of documents on here now, but I'm just going to pick out 7 and then I'm going to narrow the scope down to like 2 things. All right. So that is what's going to be expected. And then for context, what I kind of went over in the last class is, you know, it starts with 1861 to 1900. So context should really come before 1861. Does this make sense? So context should be something that's happening before that. And these notes are up. So like, you know, I posted this on like, you know what I mean? This document is actually posted up. And I don't know, if you guys can think of was there anything else? This is what we came up with last class. Is there anything else that you guys can think of for context? So some people said Bleeding Kansas, fugitive slave. I'm going to go into Dred Scott in a minute and why I think that might be one of the better ones, Market Revolution. So I think one of the things was a question about like change is you want to pick your context for what you're going to talk about. So if the topic was political and economic, which one of these things might be good to bring up? Well, yeah, you might want to bring up like market revolution. You might want to bring up like, yeah, Jacksonian Democrats, right? You might want to bring up something like that. And then you would be like, and it changed or it didn't, right? And then that would be a nice lead in for your thesis. If it's like political, social, the reason why I like Dred Scott is I feel like it's political, social, and economic a little bit-ish, right? Because there's so many parts of it. So, you know, if I was talking about like unification of the nation, I might talk about Bleeding Kansas. And then I would talk about like afterwards, are we more unified or less unified? If I was talking about cultural, I might talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin or, you know, again, like American Identity. But yeah, like Dred Scott I like because I think it relates a lot to a lot of the concepts that are in a lot of the documents, right? So that Dred Scott decision before the war, it says Black people are not citizens. And you could already see, where is that going to lead us to? A discussion about are Black folks citizens by 1900, right? We have the 14th Amendment, we have all this other stuff, right? We have essentially people are property. It focuses on property protection, right? And that folks are not free even when they go to a free state. Yeah. So I was gonna say hi. Hey, Alina, if you have a question, you might want to put it in the chat because it's gonna be hard for me to hear. Okay. All right. I hope she can hear me. Can you hear me? Anyway. Anyway. So yeah, that's why I like Dred Scott, because I feel like it sets up like U.S. and like it goes into political because of like federal power. Does that make sense? You know, like the U.S. government can't regulate slavery. I feel like you could pull on that for like a lot of things later. But I think market revolution would be good. I think any of these are good depending on what topic we get later. Does that make sense? And then you can use that as your set point for the next one. Any questions on that, on context? I feel like we got it. Okay. Alina, do you have any questions on context? All right. All right. So I think any of these would be good. So then what I decided to do is go through the documents. Okay. So doc A was that what do you call it? So doc A is, yeah, you can take a look at doc A. It is this guy. Alexander Stevens, Vice President of the Confederacy, Georgia. This is what's called the cornerstone speech. And it essentially is saying that the foundation rests upon the great truths that the you know, equal slavery, subordination, and superior race. So, you know, I think this is kind of the big part of it. I think when you're looking at documents, you need to really pay attention to dates. This is in 1861, so what is it kind of useful for in a DBQ? If we're looking at, is it revolutionary? What's that? You don't know? Yeah, one, it kind of says it's not, right? Because it's like, this is just a continuation of white supremacy. We saw like a lot of examples of this, you know, before when we were looking at the market revolution, it echoes the 1830s Calhoun positive good, right? So you can kind of connect it to that. That might even be like complexity or outside good or outside fact, right? Yeah. But I think the other thing about it is it's so early in the time period that it's almost like the definition. It's like the setting, it's like the set piece, right? This is what it was like in 1861. Let's take a look and see what it's like in 1900 or what it's like later. So it's hard, I think, with these earlier documents. You know, it's like when you're using them, you just want to be like at the beginning of the Civil War, right? You know, white supremacy was the main reason why the South left, right? I think it's important to kind of like indicate that you understand that this is like at the beginning, right? But then because it's at the beginning, you then can compare it to like another document, right? Like, do we see white supremacy later? Do we see anything change? Does that make sense? Anyway. Lena, do you have any questions on Doc A? I want to think now. All right, we're good. You guys got any questions on Doc A? B, a lot of people had questions on, and there's a lot of misconceptions. The root revenues is taxes. It's like what the nation is bringing in, and This is the United States government, 1861 to 1865. Does this have anything to do with the South? If it was the South, what would it be labeled? The Confederate States of America. Yeah. So you have to imagine that the 1861 to 1865, this is not including the Confederate States of America, who are not going to be paying taxes to the United States of America, right? And so that is important. And then you have notes, bonds, and tax revenues, and they are increasing over time. So obviously this would be more about economic, right? And what we said in the last class was like, you know, keep in mind that this is like, you could probably relate this more to like Lincoln's policies, right? Of income tax, he does war bonds, he does paper money. If you wanted like complexity, you can compare it to like Hamilton's plan. But essentially it also just kind of shows more government, bigger government, right? And that the Civil War is increasing, taxation is increasing, right? You're gonna have the first income tax during the Civil War, right? Okay. No, the only way they taxed before this was tariffs. Imports and exports, yeah. And then like they had excise taxes on whiskey and things like that, but you know, this is like the first time they're kind of doing income taxes. So it's like they do a lot of like innovations, but it's a huge amount of taxation. I think one way I like to think about politically, like the Republicans in the North have consistently been kind of checked by the South, right? So like when like we went to the Whigs and they wanted to build roads, who was it who was like, no? It was like Calhoun in the South, right? When the North wanted to do this, the South was like, no, we don't want to pay taxes, right? Consistently throughout time, Southern plantation owners do not want to pay taxes because they don't see the benefit of it. They're like, we don't need roads. All we need is more land and more slaves, right? And they don't want to pay for public education. They don't want to pay for roads. They don't want to pay for anything, right? And so it's like when the South leaves, Lincoln's like, hey, let's build the Transcontinental Railroad. Let's like get all this tax money. Let's like do all this stuff, right? And so they really are kind of like going like 100% forward with like kind of a lot of those plans since like the Federalist / Whig sort of ideas. Like, I don't know if that makes sense. And the Confederacy has a huge problem raising money because the people who hate government, who want states' right, and who hate paying taxes all left the Union. Right. And so it's like the Confederacy has to start fighting a war with people who don't want to pay taxes. Right. And so what they end up doing is printing money, and they get like a lot of inflation, and like, you know, it's like very difficult, you know, for them to do that. So anyway, I think it's revolutionary just for that. Is there questions? It's kind of difficult. It's like not an easy graph. It's also hard to analyze a graph because you can't really look into like why it says what it says. So don't imagine that you can analyze this and get your analysis points. But you can relate it to like an outside fact, like income tax or something like that. 13th Amendment, I think we've gone over it, right? I think one thing to think about, which I kind of went over, I think I'm going to kind of like stop share for a minute. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. So I'm going to make this so that Alina goes away. Let me see. View. Speaker view. Okay. You're not the speaker. Why am I not up there? I'm the one speaking, speaker view. Why would you be doing that? Full screen. No. I don't know what's going on. Why would it not put me on speaker view? This is crazy. I don't know why. They love you, Alina. I don't know. Anyway, so I want to talk about analysis a bit, and then so we talked about like revolution and counter-revolution, right? And it's really kind of, there's so much going on. Where you guys realize I am dyslexic. So I think one thing to think about is who is doing what, right? So like, when you're looking at one of the documents, who are the forces of revolution during this time? What people are trying to make change the most? What political party? Yeah, Republicans. So the political party that is this force that is trying to make change are Republicans, right? So I think one thing to take note of is what political party is doing it, right? If you can find out, if you see anything. Republicans are trying to change things. Republicans are trying to make slaves free. And part of it is political. Why do you want to have black people have the vote in the South if you're a Republican? More votes, right? Those folks are going to vote for you. You want to disenfranchise white folks and you want to enfranchise black folks, and then you're going to have Republican Southern senators, right? I mean, there's a political reason why people are doing this as well. It's not all just for like, you know, just for being nice. It's like a lot of Republicans are like, yeah, give black men the right to vote because then we're going to have Republicans in the South. Yes.
So I thought Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. So like, was it split like how it is now, where like the North was one thing, the South was mostly Republican?
Yeah. So so that is it. And the Republicans are in the North, location-wise, right? And who is this counter-revolution? Is the Democrats in the South. Does that make sense? Lincoln is a Republican.
But I thought that the Southern Republicans are. Wait, I think the Republicans were in the South.
No.
So there's some Republicans in the South. And
All right, who are the Southern Republicans? Black folks. So the black senators, those are all going to be Republicans. Southerners, white Southerners are Democrats. You got to think about it. Lincoln is a Republican. Southerners use their political organization to counter Lincoln and his party. So like the KKK is essentially a terrorist arm of the Democrats. Y'all don't listen to Trump. Trump says this all the time. He's like, Republicans are the best thing to ever happen to black folks because look at Lincoln. I mean, it flips, right? Meetings change all the time. I mean, it's not the same party, right? There's so many, they're called political realignment.
So the Republicans in the North want to end slavery so that the Republicans in the South can be Republicans and add to like the Republicans.
Yes. So the Republicans' best plan, right, is to get these free people of color to be free voters in the South. I mean, look at South Carolina. It's like, you know, more black folks than white folks. If all of those people voted, you're going to have Republican black senators in the South. If you are like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then what you also are going to try to do is like disenfranchise ex-Confederates. Does that make sense? So, yeah. So yeah, this is confusing. The other thing is, so yeah, and this is where you can bring in complexity, right? And it's hard. One way you can do complexity is you can do complexity by bringing in another category of study that I don't ask you about. So this could be confusing. But if the category I give you is political and social, does that make sense? And you're talking about political and social, then you bring in economic. Let's say you talk about like market revolution and like, I don't know, do you know what I mean? Like sectionalism or like New South. That will be that could be your complexity. Does that make sense? If I ask you about political and social, or no, if I about economic and social, and you kind of have a nice complex, but the other reason why the Republicans wanted them to be free was also to get political power, right? Like that could be complexity. Yeah, does that make sense? So by bringing in, like if you know all four, if you bring in that other category, that can also be complexity. It's confusing, but like, it's almost like why didn't it socially change in the South? Well, because of economic requirements, right? And if you bring that in, it'll give it complexity. Or why was there social change during the time? Well, because the Republicans wanted power. Does that make sense? You can almost bring that in as another category. Alina, is this making any sense to you? Do you have any questions? Okay, yes, it's making sense. Okay. The other thing you want to think about as far as where are things coming from is Congress at this point is very radical, right? But the state, especially the southern states, are the forces of counter-revolution, right? So, yeah. So, like, here's the thing, right? We passed the 13th Amendment. This is a revolution passed by Congress, right? What is the counter-revolution passed by the Democrats in the South? The challenges the freedom of people is the black codes, right? So then we're going to have the black codes. And then these guys are going to pass the 14th Amendment, which gets rid of the black codes. And then what are these guys going to pass? Plessy v. Ferguson, right? These guys are going to pass voting rights. And these guys are going to pass literacy tests. Does that make sense? These guys are going to try to do, right? These guys are going to create the KKK to put Democrats in power because they don't have political power, right? Under military reconstruction, the Republicans have all the power and the Democrats want to gain it back. So they're going to use terrorism. And these, like, the KKK targeted not just black folks, but Republicans, any Republican who was in the South, right? They're going to use terrorism to try to get people back to where it was before. And so when you're analyzing the documents, think about who is saying it. A Republican radical congressman, right? A state. Is it the, right? What are their intent in doing this? Does that make sense? So I think looking at the date is important, but also like who is doing it. So like the 13th Amendment, you could link to the Emancipation Proclamation, but also that it's passed by like radical Congress, right? After the Emancipation Proclamation. I think things that aren't revolutionary is like what it doesn't mention, like there's no land redistribution, people are still stuck on it, and there's that loophole of punishment and crime. But I think also for political, it increases the power of the government, which we said like shall have the power. All right, so I think one way to think analysis is like who is doing it, right? Which kind of goes to like black codes, right? Who is doing it? Southern states who are Democrats trying to gain power back from the 13th Amendment, right? Trying to revert it back to the status of slavery as much as possible. You know, still white supremacy, that sort of thing. Does that make sense? And I think an outside fact maybe is that it is, what would that be called? Overturned by 14th. All right, does that make sense? Okay, helpful, no helpful? Okay, so then we get down to Doc E. And yeah, what was Doc E? Oh, this was that map. No, this is, oh, the ad. A lot of people had questions on the ad. or used it in a weird way. I think your class did it a little bit better. But it's an ad from 1853. He's saying like essentially my son was sold off in 1853. He's putting an ad in a newspaper telling them, if you know this person, get in contact with me through this church, right? So if you know of my son, Alan Jones, this was the last time I knew where he was. Any information, send back to me. And so what happens is these ads would be put in like papers all over the nation, read by other African Americans who would be like, oh, hey, I know that dude. You know, tell him to write his dad in this church and like, you know, wherever, Kansas. And so like as soon as folks are like freed, they're starting to like publish these advertisements to try to find their family. Does that make sense? So yeah, it's like, yeah. After the 13th Amendment would be like context. It shows, I think, more access to education. Yeah, the people aren't property, they're not bought and sold, but it's still kind of desperate. There's not like a lot of like outreach. These are people doing it on their own. But anyway. Any questions on Doc E? The ad. Doc F is one of those documents that seems really simple. Hey, Jack, do you have any questions? You can put it in the chat. Jack or Alina, do you guys have any questions? I don't see anything. Okay, good. Okay. Okay, we're good. So that's Doc E, and then we have F. What is weird about F, and I think this could show complexity, like we were talking about with the political stuff. Let's say I asked y'all about, sorry. Was it a social revolution, right? Let's say I asked you guys, was it, if one of the parts of the question was a social revolution, and we see this at face value, what does it seem to be saying? Is it a social revolution? Doc F? Yeah, it's absolutely revolutionary, right? So, you know, I think this could also show complexity or bringing in another kind of element of analysis, right? Whenever you get a document that seems so obviously like he literally says it's revolutionary, it's giving you like an opportunity to like go deeper, right? Is it true, right? It's kind of like the next level. So I think like a B paper, what they say is like, one example of it being revolutionary is a senator who says it's revolutionary, you know? And then, but kind of what we're talking about, it might be biased. He's a radical Republican senator. He's from Maine. He's not on the ground in the South. Like he doesn't, right? He might be kind of celebratory. He might be saying this for political purposes. He is, right? And so you can use that like analysis to kind of like question it. And then that shows a little bit more complexity, and it can bring that kind of like, depending on how you do it, you could either get your complexity points. So for example, if I put this with say the black codes, which were around the same time, right? How do you, complexity can be explaining how it is that these two people have such differing views. How is it you have black codes and you have this dude in Congress saying it's an absolute revolution, right? Well, how you explain that away can be your complexity point. Does that make sense? It's one way to do it. Is there any questions on this one? All right. Thomas Nast, that was that cartoon. Thomas Nast is from New York City. He is definitely a Republican. We're gonna look at a lot of his cartoons. He's like one of these people guaranteed you're gonna see a cartoon from him on the AP. But yeah, he's illustrating the enfranchisement of African American men. You could even talk about how like one of the people pictured is like a service person or like a soldier. You know, I think you could use this for a revolution. I don't know. Any questions on that? I think that one's kind of easy. This is how they voted, by the way. They put like their vote in like a clear bottle, which is weird. About voting reforms. Anyway, we'll get more into that when we get into the Gilded Age. We good? Jack, Lena, do you have any questions? We're good? All right. All right, we went over Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the beginning. Do you guys have any questions? I kind of wrote down a lot of the stuff that we talked about, and I did this last class, but does this make sense as far as the notes? Okay. And that's it. That's as far as we got in my last class. So now we have to start doing the hard work. Yeah, let's start taking a look. We could finish out some of these documents, and then we'll have a complete review sheet for everybody. All right. So now we are at I would just put same, right? It's kind of another way to write the same. Yeah, I would keep the same amount. You know, if you see the image or if you see like that speech, it's kind of the same amount of information, unless you guys think it's anything different. All right, Doc J. Is this an example of revolution or not revolution, or what parts of it or what? Jack and Alina, we're going over the document, so if you guys have anything to add, you can definitely speak up. I think I could hear you. Let me make sure my volume's up. My Spotify, no. If I wake my son up with his Magnus mix, he'll do not want to listen to that. Lots of Minecraft rapping. Anyway, same, okay. Okay. Is it revolutionary? Can you see any elements? Yeah. I'm gonna go finish my coffee. Yeah. Yeah. I think he's, I'm pretty sure he's African American. Does it say he's African American? Former slave, yeah, okay. To state. I think one outside fact that a lot of people didn't mention is that they do pass the KKK acts, or what's known as the Force Acts. During radical reconstruction. So okay, so yeah, I think this is the thing, right? So it's not revolutionary because you see evidence that although they are free, they're being attacked by this like extra legal terrorist violence of the KKK, right? What is revolutionary is Congress is listening to this testimony, right? And I think outside fact is afterwards, after they hear about all this violence, they do pass what's called the Force Acts or the KKK Acts. And what it basically does is uses the military to stop KKK activities. They try to root it out. So, and this is during, I think this is, the important point is that, this is during military reconstruction, which ends in 1877, which I think is a pivotal point about this whole DBQ, which we haven't gotten to yet, right? So, yeah, something, they do try to stop it. And I think during military reconstruction, you do have people getting elected to Congress, which I think is like Doc K, right? Right? People are, you have more Black senators during Reconstruction than you have today, right? So it's like a big deal. Right? So that's pretty big deal, right? It's an example that like folks are voting, that it's working. But why does it stop? Why do we not have a lot of Black representation up until and including today? You guys know? Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think I hear you. Tell me if this is what you're saying. So like, yeah, the military leaves in 1877, Reconstruction ends, right? And then we call this redemption. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Redeemed? Redeemed. Okay, so yeah, it kind of goes back to the board, right? So I'll see if you guys can still hear me. So while, right, military reconstruction up until 1877, these guys are in control of the South, right? And then in 1877, essentially what happens is these guys are like, you know what, we give up, right? Y'all can have it. You can have your states. We're just going to leave it alone. We take the military out. And so when the South is under the control of the Democrats, and this is where it's weird because they don't even need the KKK anymore, right? The KKK is a terrorist organization. You don't need a terrorist organization when you control the state house, right? And so when they control the state house, they're going to pass literacy tests. They're going to pass poll taxes. They're going to pass, right, Jim Crow. They're going to pass all these things. And so when these guys give up, these guys are like, all right, we got control again. And we are in the state house and we are ahead of the police and we are doing all of the things. We control every lever of power in the South. And therefore, we'll just do what we want. So it's kind of short-lived that when the military leaves in 1877, these guys take control. That's called like redemption, or I don't know what you want to call it, but essentially it's when the Democrats take control. Anyway, does that make sense? So yeah, you could say it's short-lived. It doesn't exist after, all right? Good. The sharecropping map is complicated a little bit. I think it's a perfect example of you could use it for either one, right? I think socially, right? It's a previous plantation, but now it's like family homes. The families are intact. No one's being bought and sold, right? Before it was illegal to read, and now you can see a school on the map. There's a church, whereas before, if there was a church on a plantation, it was going to be headed by like the plantation owner, who's going to be like, you shall not steal, you shall not, you know what I mean? And now it's like an open, they can openly, freely worship the way they want. But on the other hand, you know, it's like debt peonage and, you know, can't own land. They don't leave the land, they're not relocating, and they're still engaged in cotton production. If we were to like analyze this with complexity, right? If I asked if it was economically revolutionary, would you say yes? Is sharecropping economically revolutionary? No, because they're still doing cotton, they're still tied to the land, right? I think economically it's not. Socially, maybe a little bit, right? Economically, not really. I don't know. And even socially, not, you know. I would say though, I think folks who are free, it's different life than if they weren't, you know. If your family is not being bought and sold, it's like a major deal. Anyway. Sorry guys, Jack, you guys are good? Do you have any questions? All right, I don't see anything. Where are we at? M? Brings us to the statue, right? I don't think a lot of people mention this. We looked at like the idea. What is this kind of a perfect example of? What vocab term could you relate this to? Yeah. Would lost cause be revolutionary or not revolutionary? Yeah. There's a whole bunch of really interesting books out right now about like the South actually won the Civil War, you know? I mean, not like that they won the war, but they won the peace, you know? They didn't win the battle, but when you look at like the fact that, you know, Southern, like Confederate monuments are everywhere. When you look at the fact that like white supremacy remains, when you look at the fact that like you can openly celebrate your cause afterwards and that no one does anything about it, it's like they didn't win the war, but they won the peace through like history, through veneration of their heroes, through like the way they teach things, you know. So it's, you know, and I think it shows too that like after the military leaves, people literally dust off their old, you know, when they brought up the statue of Lee, people like went up in their attics, got their old Confederate uniforms and marched down the streets. You know, it's like it sounds terrible, but like people don't have to put on hoods anymore. You don't have to dress up in a costume and like, you know, hide your identity, because this is like kind of the way it is, right? And so along with this, you're going to get Plessy v. Ferguson and all these other things, right? And it is kind of a good example of like states, you know, celebrating. I don't know. Yeah. And that could kind of be cultural. Like if you were to look at like to what extent are we actually unified after the war? To what extent do we still like, you know what I mean? Like have these differences. And then the New South. Do we think there is a New South, or is this all just a dream that never happens? Do we have industrialization in the South? In reality? No, right? Do we have, yeah. The New South is sort of a vision. LMN. There is some new manufacturing. Tobacco. I think cattle. There's another one. Paper? Furniture? There's a couple things that happen. But there's not a lot, right? When you look at the sharecropping, this could go back to that sharecropping, it doesn't really ever change. It's still cotton production. It's still very agrarian. And even when you look at like, you know, transportation developments. There is more in the south, but where is the most trains is here, right? And the Transcontinental Railroad goes to Chicago. And so this is when Chicago is going to become huge, the center of meatpacking. New York is becoming a booming metropolis. You don't have that many, you have New Orleans, you have Charleston, but you don't have a lot of urbanization in the south. There's not as much transportation in the south, all that. It does increase though, but it's not, you know, as much. And that's it. Oh, cotton, and you can bring in cotton production as well. It's increasing. We're not changing in the south to anything else really. And then of course segregation. Boom, done. Okay, does it make sense at least, right? I think this idea of counter-revolution and revolution is key. Who is saying it and what is their intent, right? These folks want to bring it back. These folks wanted to change it also for political purposes. Jack, Helena, I think I can hear you if you wanted to say something. Do you have any questions? Nope. Yes. Nope. All right. Well, I think that's it. I think I'm going to stop the meeting if you guys don't have any questions. I posted up the review sheet we were working on. And yeah, this video I'll put up as well. Okay. All right, guys, take care. I look insane.